Okay, welcome. We are continuing the discussion of early modern philosophy, and in this series, in this course, we have come to the last figure, and that is Immanuel Kant. In this video, we're going to answer this question. What is synthetic a priori knowledge? Getting a grip on this concept of the synthetic a priori is crucial for understanding what Kant is doing. So here's what we're going to do. We are going to understand Kant and his criticisms of the common sense school of philosophy. So the common sense philosophers include people like Priestley and Beatty, but more prominently for us, Reid, who we looked at last time. And the next thing that we'll do is look at the two really important distinctions that Kant makes in the Prolegomena to any future metaphysics. And these two distinctions are the analytic versus synthetic distinction and the a priori versus a posteriori distinction. So it's very easy to run these two distinctions together, but Kant is very careful to keep them separate. And once we understand how and why they're separate, we'll get to Kant's big idea. And this is the idea that metaphysical cognition is synthetic a priori judgment. Without any further ado, let's get to work. We might remember that Hume tells us that reason is unable to justify our belief in necessary cause and effect relationships. The way that Hume does it is he says, look, there are two kinds of knowledge. There are matters of fact and relations of ideas. If there is causation, if causes necessarily follow from their effects, well, that doesn't have to be true from a logical point of view, so it must be true as a matter of fact. But Hume then points out that we would then have to justify all matters of fact on the basis of a matter of fact. And in this way, Hume thinks that there is something circular in the origins and justifications of our belief in matters of fact, cause and effect relationships, and metaphysics. So, to move on, we should notice that one response that we find to Hume is from Reid. And Reid replies, look, when I perceive one thing after another, I don't just perceive the ideas of these things, I perceive things themselves. And moreover, Reid is going to say, we can know about cause and effect because our experiences of things themselves suggests causal relationships between them. Now, here's how Kant responds to this sort of response that we get from Reid, which basically says, look, common sense says, look, there is cause and effect in the world, and we can know it. Well, Kant tells us that it is positively painful to see how utterly Hume's opponents, Hume's opponents, Reid, Oswald, Beatty, and lastly Priestley, miss the point of Hume's problem. For while they were ever taking for granted that which he doubted, and it seems like Hume is doubting things like the reality of substance, but also that we can know cause and effect relationships with certainty. They were demonstrating with zeal and often impudence. Impudence sort of means like disrespect, especially of like a student to a teacher, right? So they were trying with impudence that which Hume never thought of doubting. This is an important point. To read Hume well, we should realize that Hume wasn't doubting that there are cause and effect relationships, but he was saying that the way that we know cause and effect relationships is very hard to explain in terms of either relations of ideas or matters of fact. So what Hume thinks happens with the common sense response we get from Reid is these thinkers are misconstruing Hume's valuable suggestion, and that everything remained in its old condition as if nothing had happened. So for Kant, he's going to say this common sense must be shown practically by well-considered and reasonable thoughts and words. So, to a certain extent, Kant is fine with common sense, but he's going to say you need to have common sense considered within a theoretical framework, right? You have to have well-considered reasonable thoughts about Hume's problem of induction rather than just dismissing it. So you can't appeal to common sense as an oracle. An oracle would just be a magical god that can just come right out and tell you the right answer. Well, Kant has a problem with just appealing to common sense as if it were an oracle, because that sort of approach does not offer us any rational justification for what we're believing. So, in this way, Kant agrees with Hume that experience combined with reason, all on its own, that can't justify our metaphysical belief in cause and effect. Right? Now, Kant will eventually try to give a justification for how we can engage in cause and effect thinking. He's not going to buy into Hume's answer, which is just that cause and effect is nothing more than perception of constant conjunction. Right. Now, in order to see Kant's answer, we need to spend a little bit of time on terminology. And this will help answer the question, what is synthetic a priori knowledge? Well, first we need to understand what a synthetic statement is. And we can do that by comparing the synthetic from the analytic. So analytic statements are logical truths. And the denial of these logical truths are contradictions. Right? Now, the technical way that we can put this is that the predicate is contained in the subject. So, if you look at any sentence, a sentence like, the cat is on the mat, the cat, that part of the sentence is the subject, and is on the mat is the predicate. Right? Now, what we're saying about analytic statements is that the description of the thing, that is the predicate, is built right into the subject. Right? So we could say, for instance, that the King of England is a king. Right? Now there we might say, look, that we're saying the King of England is a king, well, that's just built right into the concept of being the King of England. Right? It would be very weird to say the King of England isn't a king. In fact, we would realize that that in and of itself would be a contradiction. Right? So, in that way, we would say that what we're doing with analytic statements is we are stating logical truths, and sometimes what we're doing is we're explicating things. Right? Maybe another example that we could put is sometimes there are concepts built into other concepts, and we're just sort of explaining how the concepts fit together. So if you believe the definition of knowledge, which says that knowledge is justified true belief, well, then you might say, look, the statement knowledge is a kind of belief, that's just an analytic statement, right? We're saying that, look, there are certain things built into the other concept, right? That's what we're doing when we make analytic statements. We're just talking about concepts and how concepts fit together. Now, we can talk also about synthetic statements, right? So whereas the analytic statement was explicative, we're just explaining things, the synthetic statement is ampliative, right? That is, it's adding something to what we know, right? And another way to put this is whereas analytic statements are ones where the concept of the subject just is transported right into the predicate, For a synthetic statement, we're going to say that, well, we've got a subject of our statement, but then the predicate that comes along with it. So we've got the subject, and then we've got the predicate, and there is nothing necessarily connected between the subject and the predicate. So to go to my example of the King of England, we might say the King of England is awake right now. Now we might say that that is not built right into the concept of King of England, that the King of England is awake right now. In fact, sometimes he's awake and sometimes he's asleep. And in this way, this is why we're going to call it ampliative. It's because it's adding something new. It's telling something that we didn't already know just based on the original concept. So it's sort of saying something new. Right? So the big question that we're going to ask when we're distinguishing between analytic statements and synthetic statements is that the analytic statements are conceptual truths. Synthetic statements are not conceptual truths. Now, one thing that you might notice is this might seem familiar, especially in the way that Hume gave us the distinction between matters of fact and relations of ideas. We might say, look, it's a matter of fact that the cat is on the mat. Right? We might say, look, it's no contradiction if the cat's not on the mat. And, we'd learn it through experience. And we might say, so that's what we're dealing with when we're dealing with the synthetic, according to Hume. And then Hume is going to say, well, relations of ideas, this is just how concepts fit together, right? So these ones are going to be analytic. And Hume says, basically, that's all the knowledge that there is. All knowledge can be put into these two groups. Now, you might have noticed a little bit of sloppiness there, because one thing that I said for Hume is that matters of fact are to be understood through experience. Now notice what I've said here. All we're saying here is whether we're dealing in the realm of non-contradiction and conceptual containment at this point, right? So for Kant, the analytic versus synthetic distinction is not the same distinction as the a priori versus a posteriori distinction. Right? So when we're talking about a priori knowledge, we're not talking about sort of like the grammar of the sentence, whether there is a relation of conceptual containment between subject and predicate. Instead, we're going to ask this question of, how do you know it? Right? What methods can get us to knowing something? And philosophers have noticed before that we might make a distinction between the a priori, that which you know no matter what the world happens to be like and no matter what experiences we have. So we might say, look, there's some stuff that you just know whether or not you've had any experiences. And one thing that we might say is like, maybe that's kind of like math. We might say that 2 is greater than 3. 2 is less than 3, right? Or we might say the internal angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees. After you learn enough about triangles or enough about integers to know that 2 is less than 3, we might say these are things that you know independent of experience, right? You don't have to go and do science experiments to confirm that 2 is less than 3, right? But we can also talk about a posteriori knowledge. So we might say, look, there are a lot of things that you only know because you've gone out and experienced the world. So I look out the window and I see that it's sunny today, or I see that there's 2 dogs laying quietly in the room by my feet. These are things that we can confirm via experience. Right? Now, here's the key move, right? We can ask the question of conceptual containment and whether we've got an expletive or ampliative statement. But we can also ask the question of whether you need particular sense experience to know these things, right? And here's the big trick, right? Whereas Hume is going to think that all analytic knowledge is a priori knowledge and vice versa, and that all a posteriori knowledge is synthetic, what Kant is going to do is he's going to say that these concepts are not always stuck together, right? So the big idea is Kant is going to argue that, that an important realm of knowledge is ampliative. So we're going beyond just conceptual truths, but these things that are more than just conceptual truths could be known a priori. So for Kant, he's going to say, look, there are some things that are necessarily true, and necessary truths are a priori for Kant. Here's one way that Kant is going to push this line of thought. And he's going to say, Hume messed up when he said that all necessary truths, that is, all analytic statements, or all non-experiential things are just conceptual truths, right? So Hume casts his eye over the whole field of a priori cognition, so the stuff you know independent of experience, in which human understanding claims such mighty possessions, and heedlessly severed it from a whole, and indeed its most valuable province, mathematics. Right? For he thought its nature, or so to speak, the state constitution of this empire, depended on totally different principles, namely the law of non-contradiction alone. So part of what Hume is going to be doing here is he's going to say, look, when we're thinking about the statement that 2 is less than 3, or that triangles have internal angles that add up to 180 degrees, Hume is going to say these are just conceptual truths. They're sort of in the same realm as the statement that the King of England is a king. Right? So basically, Kant goes on. What Hume said was equivalent to this, that mathematics contains only analytical judgments, but metaphysics, synthetical a priori judgments. Right? And in this way, Kant says that Hume was mistaken. And the mistake had an injurious effect upon his whole conception. But for this, he would have extended his question beyond synthetical judgments, far beyond the mathematical concept of causality, the metaphysical concept of causality, and would have included in it the possibility of mathematics a priori also. For this latter, he must have assumed to be equally synthetical. So here's part of what Kant is on about here. He's going to say, you can learn new things in math, much like you might be able to learn new things about the way the world is. And in this way, math can be informative, right? So one of my favorite proofs in math is the proof that there is an infinite number of prime numbers, right? Now, we might say that when you learn that the number of prime numbers is infinite rather than finite, you might actually say that's a really cool new bit of knowledge. And we might say you don't just learn that by thinking about the definition of what it is for a number to be prime, that is, divisible by only itself and 1, but not any other whole numbers in whole number solutions. Right. So in this way, Kant is going to point out that Hume, if he had really thought harder about math, Kant thinks, would have realized that math can give you new knowledge. Right? Now, here's the point. He's going to say, in this way, Hume should have said that mathematics is synthetic, But we should also realize that mathematics is a priori, right? And in this way, Kant is going to say that statements in math are a priori, but not simply conceptual truths. So he thinks that Hume was wrong to suggest that all a priori knowledge is simply analytic, right? So here's how you might sort of like sort through statements for Kant. We can ask the question, can something be known independent of experience? The question of whether you're depending on experience to know something is the difference between a priori and a posteriori. Right. Now, Kant actually says that there is no such thing as an analytic a posteriori truth. That is, we never go into conceptual containment claims when we're depending on experience. Right. So the stuff that we know a posteriori is sort of like the common matters of fact that Hume would agree on. Right. The cat is on the mat, or it's sunny today. This is the stuff that you learn from experience. Right. And then Kant is going to ask us, well, we can ask the independent of experience question, but then we can also ask the question, can something be known as a conceptual truth or as a matter of non-contradiction? And if something is just about conceptual truth or just about not contradicting yourself, he's going to say that's an analytic statement. So famous analytic statement. All bachelors are unmarried. You don't have to meet a bunch of bachelors and check whether they're also married. You just have to understand what it means to be a bachelor, right? To be a bachelor is something to be like an unmarried, eligible man, something like that. We might have some trouble, like whether a male baby is a bachelor or whether a widower is a bachelor. But we would consider unmarried men bachelors. Right? And then we realize that the concept of being unmarried is just built into the concept of bachelorhood. Kant also gives a strange example. Some people might dispute it. They might say maybe this is more of an a posteriori bit of knowledge, but Kant claims it as a priori. He says that gold is a yellow metal. He seems to think that after you've seen enough gold, and you know what people are talking about when they talk about gold, we're going to say that yellowness and metalness are just built right into the concept of gold. Right? And in this way, that is an a priori analytic truth. So these two concepts right here, the a priori analytic and the a posteriori synthetic, those are Kant's, those are Hume's relations of ideas up here in the a priori analytic, and matters of fact, the a posteriori synthetic down here. But now Kant is going to say sometimes we have statements that are known a priori. You couldn't prove these necessary truths simply by experience, but they're not just simple conceptual claims about what concepts are built into the subject of a statement. So here's the first one. Kant says the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. Now, we might have point A right here and point B right here. We might realize that you can't make a short distance by having a curved line or a zigzag line, right? But the best way, that's my best attempt at drawing a straight line here, we might realize that the straighter the line gets, the shorter the distance traveled between the 2 points will be. And in this way, we're going to say, look, these claims about, on the one hand, shortness, right? Shortness is different from the concept of straightness, right? So Kant is going to say that the concept of straight is not built into the concept of the shortest distance, right? So in this way, if we ask Kant, is this statement a simple conceptual truth or a matter of non-contradiction? Well, in a certain way, no. There is nothing conceptually true about the shortness coming from straight lineness, right? So in this way, Kant is going to say, actually, we've got a synthetic claim here, right? We have gone beyond the concept of straightness, or we've gone from the concept of shortest distance, and we've learned a new thing about it, that it's straightness. Right? He also makes the claim about a statement of arithmetic. 7 plus 5 equals 12. That's a necessary truth, and you don't have to check it using experience or science experiments once you've really grasped what it means and why it's true. But he's going to say that 12ness is not built into the concept of 7 coming together with 5. And in this way, Kant thinks that there is no necessary conceptual connection, even though there is a necessary connection between these two statements. Now, here's another one. Kant is going to tell us that every effect follows from its cause necessarily. Right? Now, Hume taught us that the cause and effect relationship isn't just a conceptual truth. It seems more like something that might be true or it might not be true. So it's not a matter of non-contradiction. But Kant is also going to say cause and effect does seem to be a necessary relation, but it's a necessary relation that can't be learned through experience. So if it's a necessary relation, it needs to be a priori, but it's also not a simple conceptual truth. So for Kant, he's going to point out that here we have knowledge that is synthetic. So it tells us something new, but it's something that goes beyond simple experience. Now, why is this so important? Well, for Kant, this is because his central question in the Critique of Pure Reason, as well as our reading from the Prolegomena, his big question is, what is metaphysics, and why is it a synthetic a priori area of inquiry? Right? So let's break this down a little bit. He's going to say that if we're going to do metaphysics, if we're going to speculate about the nature of reality, it's going to need to be synthetic. It needs to tell us something new, right? But it's not like we're just doing science experiments, right? That's not metaphysics. That's the natural sciences for Kant. Right? So we need metaphysics to be informative. And he's also going to say that metaphysics can't just be conjecture and guessing. Some of the theories that we learned about in this course, when we were looking at theories, sort of making statements about the inertness of matter as Hobbes thought about it, or whether matter is ultimately vital and has its own mind, as Leibniz and Conway were suggesting. Kant is going to say, if we get these wildly different answers, this is going to be an embarrassment for metaphysics. It's going to make metaphysics look like just a bunch of conjecture, right? So what Kant wants to do is he's going to say, we need metaphysics to tell us something new, but it needs to be a priori, right? So we need to do it independently of our senses, but it needs to tell us something about reality. Now, this is ultimately going to lead Kant into a view called Transcendental idealism. This is the view that the conditions for the possibility of metaphysical cognitions, and this is going to be cognitions about the nature of space and time and causal connection. Kant is going to say these are ultimately claims that are going to be based on what it's possible for us to experience at all. So he's going to say we have to look at the world through the lens not only of space and time, but also of causal connection. So we get these concepts back, but he's also saying that these concepts, space, time, causal connection, are actually built into our heads. That is, they are the conditions of our experience, rather than the way that the world is outside and around us. But for Kant, this is a way of doing metaphysics in a way that is synthetic, so we can learn things about space, time, and causation. We can do it a priori, because we're not simply observing the world, but we're observing our ways of experiencing the world. Now, this question of transcendental idealism is difficult, and we'll spend a little bit of time getting a feel for how Kant argues for it. But at this point, I just want to make sure that we are on board with this general idea of synthetic a priori experience. It's something that you can know independent of experience, but it goes beyond the simple conceptual truths, the relations of ideas that Hume was telling us about. And once we realize that the question of independence from experience can be pulled apart from the idea of conceptual truth, right? This is going to make room for Kant to say that when we do metaphysics, we are doing something that isn't just experiential knowledge, but we're not also just thinking about conceptual truths that are coming out of the dictionary. And with that insight, we will eventually get an argument for transcendental idealism. So we'll stop here for today. Thanks for following along with me, and we will continue things next time. Take care.